Welcome to Subject to Power. I'm El Kamahira. Before we get started today, I want to let you know that we will be discussing some difficult topics that may be distressing to some people, including child abuse, human trafficking, suicide, and torture. So please take care when listening. On today's episode, I'm welcoming two extraordinary women, Linda MacDonald and Jeanne Sarson. Jeanne and Linda spent their whole working lives as public health nurses in Nova Scotia, Canada, ministering to and providing care for young and old alike throughout their province. As carers, they came into contact, of course, with a lot of family violence and abuse of women and children, and advocating for and counseling victims became part of their job and their personal mission. But in 1993, Linda and Jeanne had a fateful encounter with a woman who reported being a victim of lifelong systematic torture. And they soon realized that they were dealing with a very different category of harm. And this realization set their careers and their lives in a whole new direction. The story of how Jeanne and Linda helped and cared for this torture victim, what they discovered about organized torture networks, and becoming global activists in the process, is chronicled in their book, Women Unsilenced. In this hour, I talk with Jeanne and Linda about their story, their decades of research, their mapping of non-state torture as a phenomenon, as a crime, and as a human rights violation against mostly women and children, and their mission to educate us all about who the perpetrators are and how they operate. Also, about how they used nursing science and an unshakable ethic of care to help victims break out of the silence, to tell of their victimization, to escape, and to heal from their traumas. Now, the release of the Epstein files, but also social media and the connectivity of the internet as a whole, has made dark secrets harder to keep, and torture is now more visible than ever, both as instruments of war and genocide, but also in private enterprises, in formal networks, and in families. Systematic cruelty against women and children is not new, of course, but the term torture is still reserved mostly for men. Think political prisoners, prisoners of war, victims of evil regimes. But Linda and Jeanne's work is radically broadening how we understand torture, and most crucially is bringing the suffering of women and children into the center. I'm super excited to talk to you. I know it's a very serious subject matter, and we'll get into it in a minute, but there's so much to learn from this, I feel, and you have been on this beat for so many years, and I'm sure have a very unique perspective into what is happening now. It is a very unique moment in time in the culture with the Epstein files, and not just the Epstein files, but every day across my feed, I see news items of some story of victimization that so resembles what you talk about in your book. So I thought maybe start with your story. How did it all begin, and how did you all become involved in this arena?
Well, it started, Linda and I were both community or public health nurses, and so-called family violence, which involved physical, sexualized, and psychological violence, was an issue, a public health issue. It was when we were practicing, and it was always on our agenda. Given that both of us were born into families with very misogynistic and violent fathers, it was like an everyday reality for us, how we grew up and how we had to deal with it, and what society's responses were to us, even as children, trying to tell, or my our mothers coping with it or pretending it didn't exist. When we were kids growing up, it was just considered a family matter and easily dismissed. Anyway, we worked in the same office and decided that there wasn't enough non-pathology. And by what I mean by non-pathology is that anyone who has been victimized through relationship violence, that is not a mental illness. That means a crime has been committed against you. You've been victimized. And how do you cope with victimization becomes the critical issue. How you survive, how you stay safe in a relationship that is supposed to be caring and supportive, family relationship or intimate relationship of some sort. So we decided to start one evening a week, psychoeducational nursing-based practice for anyone experiencing relationship violence, whether it was in a family, whether it was in an intimate relationship, whether you were a teenager, whether you were female or male, it really did not matter. And we were seeing success that especially young people who were just starting university, they just needed some education about power and control and understanding their own responses. But then one night I got a call on our business phone late at night. I can tell you it was 11:11, but I had that intuitive sense that I should pick it up. And I did pick it up, and it was a woman that had no idea who she was. She wasn't going to share any information about herself. But she just said she was going to die in 4 days. And she wondered why I picked up the phone, because it was her like testing to say, well, nobody cares. Nobody cares what's happening to me. So I'll call this late number. Nobody's going to answer it. And that will just be the evidence that I need to die in 4 days. So, of course, when I picked up the phone, that's not what she expected. So we talked for about an hour. She agreed to call back the next day. I had no intervention that I could do except to trust that maybe she would call the next day. I'll talk to Linda about it. What are we going to do if she calls? Because that's not a service we can provide, 24-hour emergency service. So the next day I waited all day, and again around 11 o'clock she called again, and this time she was angry because it was like, why are you picking up the phone? Now you're really telling me that you care, and if you care, how am I going to justify dying in a few days? But she did promise to see us, meet Linda and I outdoors on a park bench near her car in case she wanted to get up and just take off. And that was how it started. We had no idea at that moment in time that it would change our lives. We weren't prepared for what was going to unfold.
Do you want to pick it up from there, Linda?
Yeah, so the second time she came, she agreed that she wanted to come inside the office. So we got up there and sat around the room. Like a few minutes into it, she was in a corner in a ball in the corner of the room. And she just started unfolding all these horror stories about torture. And it didn't alarm Jeanne and I. We knew she was remembering and we knew she was okay. But we'd never heard the detail of torture that she had described. And so then we realized, well, this is interesting. We sat with her and on the floor and listened to her story till she unfolded the whole memory. And when she did, she was fine. She got back up and we let her rest for a little while, and then she got up and drove home. Then we booked another appointment and she came, and the same thing happened again. And after this, I think it was the second time before we said, okay, so we're dealing with torture here. This is not abuse.
Mm.
And we don't have any skill around helping people heal with torture because we haven't been tortured ourselves. We don't have any background in it. And she was suicidal, so we thought we'd see if we could find somebody in the province that did, and no one did, or no one wanted to help. We even contacted people out west, and the woman said, "Well, you sound like you're doing really well if she trusts you, and just go with it." So that's what we decided to do. Her memories just came in waves, just like if you're with a woman in labor. That's what it reminded us of as nurses. A labor that was years long, not a 24 hours long, but you just had to sit with the wave and know that the memory would start off with a bell curve of her responses, and then get into the details of the memory, and then she'd come out the other side and be exhausted, and we often had to let her sleep. So that's where we were in sessions of anywhere from 2 to 4, sometimes 7 hours. Be in the middle of the night, we'd be getting home. And this went on for a long time until eventually she got stabilized and stopped being suicidal and stopped disassociating, and started understanding the crime herself, because she was so disassociated. She really didn't understand, because she was living two lives. She was a master's educated professional woman who went out during the day and did her job, and then at night she would be tortured and trafficked by her family and the criminal informal network around her. So it was a very disconnected life that she lived. And as she started coming together with the different memories, then she started realizing that she wasn't safe, because she was aware of going into the torture, and she had to learn to pull out. We had to know that we couldn't stop her. She eventually pulled herself out of all the torture, but that was really hard to know that she was still actively involved in being tortured, not only by her family, but by alleged perpetrators in the community that were professionals that we knew, which made it very complex.
Yeah, reading this made me a little bit crazy. One, that to know that it was ongoing and that you were powerless to just stop it in the moment. And also, had I read your story a few years ago, I may myself have doubted the veracity of the story because it just sounds so out there. And I wonder if you had moments where you're in listening to her and taking in her story and trying to care for her, that you yourself had thoughts of, is this really, really true? You're
No.
shaking your head. Yeah.
No, never.
Yeah.
Because I think sitting with her as she was remembering, there's no way she could have acted the way she did. And we asked clarifying questions to make sure, because she was conditioned to think things that weren't true. She was drugged and people were dressed up in costumes. So we clarified those things. But no, I never did doubt her, just because her suffering was so extreme. And I think because being a nurse and watching people suffer, the responses that you're looking for, and they were consistent with other kinds of pain that I'd seen. The other thing that happened is 2 of the alleged perpetrators that she started naming, she didn't know we knew them. Then we had a complaint laid against us by those people. So we knew then that they knew she was getting better and they were trying to stop us. So that was even more validation.
And this, just to clarify, is something that she had been subjected to since she was a child, correct?
She was born into a family, so that meant, from our perspective, both her mother and her father were knowingly involved. Some women later on said their mothers did not know, but at the same time, we had to also question, we think the mothers knew, but decided not to deal with the issue, to pretend it didn't happen. And we even had stories that we knew the grandmothers understood too, that they might not have been actively torturing, but they knew that their granddaughter was being victimized, either because they were victimized as a child, because, if we went back 100 years, the issue that women were being subjected to serious victimizations is not new. Just because we didn't want to name it, or just because we wanted to look the other way, because women and girls, whatever happened to them, it didn't matter. It was a family matter, regardless of how severe it was. We also had to question, just by listening to the stories, that the grandmothers developed techniques to help their granddaughters stay disassociative. For example, I can say a grandmother might have held her granddaughter on her lap and talked quietly to her and rubbed her gently and asked her to focus on the doll that was over there. We called it a co-culture, Al. We called it because you have to understand what you're walking into. And that's why it's so important that we write in the book about the MO of the perpetrators, because we had to understand what their techniques were in order to understand what survival skills occurred for the women to still be alive. As little girls, as babies, they were probably being victimized, maybe from the moment they were born. That victimization increases and increases. If you've ever taken care of a baby, a baby gets distressed. They start crying and they're not happy. So just imagine if a baby is feeling that unsafe, how quickly their brain and their body starts surviving. We marveled at the survival skills of women. That's why we're so strong on a non-pathology model. How can we pathologize as disordered when somebody is put into a situation that all they have is survival? That has to be their prime skill. They just are responding to that survival need to stay alive.
Sure.
And we weren't that naive that we didn't ask clarifying questions.
No.
We were always asking clarifying questions because we wanted to know how they got away with it. How the perpetrators we were always thinking about them and how they were doing this and hiding it. And she answered everything and was always consistent. So that was important. I was thinking this is just another form of crime that hasn't been exposed yet. And we have to do a really good job to document it so that we can help to get it exposed. I think right from the beginning, because we knew that she had nieces and nephews, extended families, that this couldn't just be her alone. It had to be other people involved. She told of families that she knew in Newfoundland. So we knew there was children over there. We both were always thinking of other women and children we didn't know that were being harmed, and tried to make a long view of trying to help a lot of people, not just her. It had to be more than just her. That's the way we took it on.
Sure. Thanks for explaining that, because I think that's the first thing that will pop into people's minds. And what you're saying makes so much sense in terms of grasping it for what it was. So you're decades hence, but then this was new to you. And so it's fascinating to read your story of kind of mapping this new landscape, or this co-culture, as you say, and try to sort of make models, or almost researching it scientifically, what is this thing?
One thing Linda and I spoke a lot about is how helpful our nursing was. I think that was a key for us, because in nursing, the helping relationship is always about trying to understand what people are coming to find answers for. Like, if you go to a medical person, you go with a concern and you're looking for an answer. Here she was presenting with something we didn't know anything about. So in order to learn, we had to pay attention to her so-called symptoms, if you will, and then try to make sense where that was coming from. So that meant we had to then scientifically understand what the co-culture of non-state torture victimization was. What do the perps do, and what is the impact physically on a person's body? What is the impact of the drugging that they use? What is the impact on the brain? And like Linda mentioned earlier, we were constantly asking challenging questions, which you do in nursing anyway. So that kind of was a natural process for us to follow. It was nursing science. We were looking at it in that way. And before we even said anything publicly, Linda and I sat down and said, we have to know how the world is defining torture. When we weren't at work full time, we were working at night trying to clarify first the definition. What are the acts that globally have defined as torture? And when we went researching that, we're talking in 1993, there was no research that any community, whether it was Amnesty International, whether it was the United Nations Special Rapporteurs on Torture, there was no kind of, oh, here's a list very quickly. This is what the globe has said identifies as acts of torture. So our research brought us into understanding state torture, which is often called classic torture because it's fairly universal. Doesn't matter which country it's being perpetrated in. And we made that list. And of course, we got the main themes of physical torture, electric shocking, water torture that everybody seems to understand, psychological torture, sexualized torture. We had the whole list, and we took that list and then we compared it to Sarah. And then 5 years after Sarah came, we decided she can't be the only one in our province of Nova Scotia in Canada that says that she was tortured. And we just put out word of mouth, and 5 other women came and they told us their story. And then we showed them the model we had created, if it made sense to them. And they were telling the same story. They didn't know each other. They lived in different communities in our province. And that's when we felt that, okay, we have this model. Women are saying they endure the same forms of torture, victimizations, as when the whole global community are saying that state tortures like police or military or embassy staff engage in. So you've got the same crimes on both sides. Mm-hmm. Tragically, from when the UN started creating human rights treaties, including the Convention Against Torture, when we started looking, we kept learning that they were either thinking it was a family matter. They didn't think of women and girls at all. They were focused on the events that challenge men and the risks that they get tortured. So
in a scenario of a war or being a POW or being imprisoned, that torture happens to warriors or men in that scenario, and that's the torture that the UN is concerned about.
Yeah, it was a shock. The discrimination was a real shock. And we went to our own criminal code, assuming that there would be a law against torture, right? And there was, but only if you were police or military. Like, we were just so shocked by the discrimination, the patriarchal divide, because then we realized we were up against a real block. We were very, very serious that we were in this and people sometimes have a hard time believing this, but it wasn't too long after we started that we developed a 60 plan, 60 years. We felt it would probably take us 60 years once we realized how many obstacles we were up against. Sounds kind of crazy now, even to myself, but that's the truth.
Wow.
Yeah, we knew it would be a long battle. And so we're only 33 years in. We still got another 27 to go.
That is kind of incredible to think about, that the resistance would be so extreme and that it would take so much time for the culture to kind of catch up to the idea.
Yeah.
But like when you say there are no laws against torture because it happens in the private realm and not in the state realm, I feel my brain exploding. Like, what do you mean?
Well, there are a few now, like in France there is, and there's one in Michigan, and there's one in California. South Dakota developed one based on our work, which was kind of exciting. So there's a few
great.
places, but still the discrimination is so intense, so immense. And I just found an article yesterday about a woman. Her name was Frances Power Cobb. She was born in Ireland, and she was a journalist and a feminist. And in 1878, she wrote an article called Wife Torture, because she knew that in order for the law and the government to take women's battering and mangling, and she called different names for it, to take it seriously, she had to identify torture. She was able to influence the law at the time so that women could get a divorce for reasons of violence. So she was successful there, but torture never took on to think of women as being tortured. So here we are, like 148 years later, and we're still on this curve.
So obviously people will have difficulties understanding the difference between what we have defined, which is abuse, domestic violence, assaults, rapes, etc., distinct groups of violence, and then you have torture. How would you define the difference?
The difference is the intent. With abuse, the intention is to control the woman or child, or sometimes men. So you control them with power and control. But with torture, the intention is destruction. It's destruction of the person's sense of self. It goes way beyond control. So that's when you get the extreme forms of dissociation, captivity. It doesn't have to be physical captivity. You could, like Sarah, she walked out every day and into the world out of her apartment, but she still was psychologically captive in her mind. Every moment of her existence, she was thinking about her family and believing they knew where she was all time. And they had really almost destroyed her until she came to us, and then she was able to regain herself. And that's the second book we have about getting myself back. Women can do that, and that's the power of the work that we do. We help women to recapture themselves, regain themselves, and you can heal. But it takes a lot of work. With Sarah, it was a long process. And that's what they found out with the prisoners of war, too, that they took long, long times to heal, long sessions and much more than 6 months. The acts are so destructive that they cause so much psychological, emotional, spiritual, physical harms that the torture is different. And it's always intentional, it's never accidental. And a person can never consent to it legally, which makes it important for law for women to know, especially when you think of pornography and prostitution and rape, serial rape and gang rape. There's no question the court, if we could get the laws, the courts wouldn't be asking the women whether they consented or not. That's irrelevant because it's non-state torture.
Why would somebody decide that they shouldn't believe a woman when she's telling the same thing as her neighbor next door, who was in a prisoner of war camp, is explaining the same thing? Why is it that we have difficulty voicing that truth? It's a question that Linda and I have asked repeatedly. We explain it to ourselves. We say, okay, we've all been born into patriarchy. Little girls were of less value than boys. And it still is that way. I mean, why is it that we should have so much difficulty when it's women and little girls who are telling these stories?
And the other thing, though, they're really good at hiding. In war, we know what's going on. It's on the battlefield. We know that there's prisoners of war camps. But I mean, if you look at Epstein, you know how well he manipulated people, how well they hid it. Although, for anybody with half a brain, I think watching those stories about the island, people would figure out. I was watching the designer today who had to quit. He couldn't cope with knowing that he was making bunk beds and little pink rooms. He knew that it wasn't about women, it was about girls, right? So there were people that saw things going on. But I mean, they are really good at hiding because they work just like the priests did to manipulate the population and think they were good men. So these people are beacons in the church, or they're parent teachers, or they're politicians. They really work at their cover. And they've done that for a long, long time. So we're conditioned to believing somebody by their positional power. So the thing is that we knew people didn't believe us, but I didn't really realize that how many people really thought we were crazy. A few people told us they really, really thought we were mentally ill. And that hadn't really dawned on me at the time. Anyways, we knew we weren't, and I guess that was the key.
I mean, the other thing that goes on, I think bystanders go into fear. And I understand there's some legitimate reason to fear, because if they out somebody and it becomes visible who it is that's talking, they worry about liability. And there's some things we can do about that with better whistleblowing security and improved protection for people who are disclosing their concerns. But it is a social cultural issue, totally, and it's based on positions of power. And
people tell us they just didn't want to believe it either. They knew that we weren't liars. They knew we were honest women and that we don't exaggerate, but they just didn't want to believe it. So for Jeanne and I, we just accepted it right away and worked on shifting our worldview, because it does take a worldview shift. And we can see that now with people with Epstein. It is a worldview shift. That's like Me Too's kind of started it. And then, Harvey Weinstein, those things started it. But Epstein has taken it to a different level to show how the co-culture or the criminal informal network can be so vast and international, which we learned with many women as well. So there's there's small criminal informal networks, and there's big ones and medium-sized ones. They're as large as people want to organize.
I can imagine that you feel vindicated in a way now. Do you? In a sense that what you saw so many years ago, people are now finally coming around to understanding.
I wouldn't use the word vindicated, I guess.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it's because for Linda and I, we just accepted it. So I think when Sarah came, it was just accepting that we had a big job to do. The more and more we understood the degree of invisibilization and how complex it was in every structure of our evolution, of our culture, I would say I'm feeling some relief that maybe we're breaking through, because the concern was always for Linda and I. We knew that we had to be very scientific when we came out, because if people could put us down enough to dismiss us, that would mean that the women who had trusted us, their storytelling would be dismissed. And that was a critical line for us to make sure that the safe space we created was solid. So that's the nursing science that came into it, the educational science, because we knew it was a huge responsibility, that we were being entrusted with stories that they had never told and never trusted anybody to understand. Because often when women call us, they'll say very quickly, "We know you know," because we know the culture. That carries a responsibility that if they go out there, that they're safe, knowing that we're the front line, if you will, to break the silence. So it's more of a relief that we're creating safe space.
The ultimate dream is to prevent non-state torture. So that means that you're always thinking, I really do. Honestly, I go to bed every night knowing that there's little children at night being tortured. I live with that reality every day. I'm always thinking of them and the women too, but especially the little ones, because if you're tortured from birth on, it's a horrible reality to have to grow up in. So someday, if we can get it recognized as it's an everyday crime that's going on all around the world. It's just a fact. And if people can start doing assessments thinking of that, they're going to pick up these kids a lot earlier. So we weren't going to do anything to jeopardize that someday down the road, those little kids might be identified. That was always our goal. And I can say too, like for me as a child, didn't have the same childhood as Jeanne. My father and mother did a good job to try to hide the violence. But I used to go out and tell it all the time, everywhere, and nobody believed me. And when I got to be a teenager, I even brought my best friend home when my father was in a drunken rage to show her what he looked like so that she'd believe me. And, 2 weeks later, it's like it never happened to her. 10 years ago, I asked her, I said, now, Debbie, do you remember me taking you home and showing your dad when he was in a drunken rage? No, she has no memory of it. So she blocked all that out, right? I was used to people not believing me. I just started being very conscious of knowing how responsible it was for me to believe others and to believe their story and help them move forward with it. And I was very thankful when the Epstein case came out because I thought that means more people are going to believe the women. And it's tragic that the women from the Epstein case were harmed, but it's positive that they're being believed now.
Yes, but are they? It's like, I think we're in a little bit of a threshold situation where we're like, are we really ready as a culture to embrace these stories? Or are we going to retreat to protecting the predator class? I think we haven't quite crossed the threshold. And I also think, like, speaking personally, I think there's almost like a grief process to look at the world that we live in and understand this fact that,
Definitely,
like you said, little kids are being tortured all over the place, that it's a pleasure, that it's a business, an organized activity for a lot of people. Like, there are a lot of hands in this, a lot of criminal minds in this.
yeah.
And I think coming to the admitting that this is the world we live in, it's a very painful realization.
Oh, it was painful, the grieving process for me, but I do believe that it's shifted. I don't think that the justice system, maybe, or the legal system, I should call it, instead of the justice system. I don't think the legal system is supportive yet. And I don't believe that the position of power, they know what's happening, but they're trying to cover it up. But I think the everyday person, I think they've shifted. I think enough of us have shifted that it'll never go back, that it won't be believed because they've got the documentation. When you get the perpetrator's email saying that I loved the torture video, you can't really go back. It's like when the Nazis were finally discovered and you started seeing all the evidence of the Holocaust. We really couldn't go back, even though people didn't want to believe it until they actually saw it after they went into the concentration camps. So when I say a worldview shift, that means that there's a grieving process in that, for sure.
I don't grieve it. Actually, I think I developed respect and appreciation very young because I remember when my mother left for the last time, I was so thrilled, and I never lost that thrill, even though the community ostracized us because, of course, she was a single mother when you weren't supposed to leave your husband. But I've always maintained that thrill of knowing how fortunate it was that she could leave. We can't lose sight of that. That gives us hope, that gives us possibility. But it also, in defining the victimization, it's also prevention. If I know something clear enough, then maybe I can protect myself, or maybe I will make different decisions growing up than if I did not know what the reality of the world is. I mean, I have two sons, and in some of their work, they've come across psychopaths, and they've had to deal with them. But I watch them because they grew up knowing what Linda and I went through as children, because Linda talks to her children, and I've always shared with my children my life. So I've watched them as a parent and realized that they've learned in the process of learning about the reality. And I've watched them and think they made out fine for that reason, because they just knew that what they were up against. Linda and I have talked about, well, how do you educate children? And one thing, keeping a child naive growing up is not a positive way to parent a child, because you're sending them out into a world
unequipped.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think we have to start thinking of, if I know the truth, that's a positive. We have to develop resilience. And I think resilience comes from knowing what can be helpful, what can be hopeful, what's possible to achieve if we're honest with each other and understand what we're up against. You know, if you're a parent and you're trying to prepare your child for the world around them, it's to develop that resilience and to know that as our species, that's how we evolve, but we can evolve differently if we start creating the lines in the sand that start saying, no, at a very young age, this is not acceptable.
I don't mean grieving is negative, because the end part of grieving is acceptance. That's where you get the freedom. And that's where joy comes from. Because people ask us, like, do we have vicarious trauma? Do we need counseling all the time with these stories? We say no, because for me, I mean, it's a great privilege. It's a great honor, and it's a great joy to be able to share all the knowledge we have, to know that we are opening the door for other women and children to be able to talk down the road, and some of them now, you know, and they contact us and tell us. That's a joy. And so all this hard work was worth it, and I don't feel traumatized in the least bit. And my daughter, I was talking to her yesterday, and she was bringing up the Epstein story, and she said, you know, Mom, everybody's so traumatized by this story. She said, for me, it's nothing, because I grew up hearing all this. But she, you know, she didn't really understand the value of learning about these crimes and these criminal informal networks when she was small, until now that she's starting to realize that she's already accepted that reality, so she can move forward in it. It is freedom once you accept it. You know, I was very insistent on educating my 3 children, 1 boy and 2 girls, about the risks of human trafficking. And now this was long before they were talking about it on the street corner like they do now. So I know some people thought I was being not a good parent by giving them information. But she was especially the most rebellious one, and she associated with kids that I really didn't want her to associate with, but I had no control over all of that. So one of her friends had died, and another friend, who I trusted as well, came and said, why don't I take you to Halifax, and we'll drive to Halifax, so I know you're sad, and I'll get you a nice sweater. So she said, sure. And so I knew he was taking her. Never thought much about it, really. And she came home later that day, and she was just as white as a ghost and shaking. And she said, Mom, come upstairs. And she just fell to the floor in her bedroom. And she said, what happened is he took her to this man's house and sat her down. And the man had a stack of cash, really, you know, quite high. And he was trying to pull her into human trafficking. He said, if you stay with me, this is what your life will be like. You'll have lots of this. And he thought that he was going to be able to trick her. And she knew right away what his tactics were. So she said she really was conscious of not letting him know that she knew what he was doing, so that she could get out. So she sat down and calmly, fed his ego like they like to be fed, and told him that she was really interested in it, but she just had a few things she had to sort out in her personal life, and she'd be back. And she was really looking forward to working with him. And she got up and she went out, and she didn't even tell her friend that she had clued in. She didn't tell anybody till she got home and told me, and she was just in hysterics. Now, if she hadn't been educated, I might have never seen her again.
Wow. What an illustration of the value of equipping your kid with real life knowledge and real life risks.
Yeah.
You know, I'm thinking about how young people who are reading the news now and reading about Epstein and understanding a little bit about, they had these rich model agents that went to the Eastern Bloc and picked up 12-year-olds for sexual trafficking. Like, we have now a whole generation of teenagers and young people who will pick that up and understand
That's right.
that's how the world works. That's how it operates. And I think that is positive.
Yeah, that's where they get power, the power of knowledge.
Yes, yes. So I wanted to jump back a little bit to you. Obviously, treating Sarah was a big part of your evolution, but then you started something you called kitchen table research. And I would love for you to tell me a little bit about what that entailed and what you learned. And
we called it kitchen table research because that's exactly what we did. We sat mostly at women's kitchen tables or in their living room. And we just thought that Sarah wasn't enough to really validate the work that we were doing, the science, that the grassroots nursing science that we were developing. So we put out word of mouth. Anyone in the province might be interested in sharing their story. And we found 5 women. We went to them. And as community health nurses, that was a normal practice for us. We always went to the person's house and we'd drive all over different areas in the province. And we'd sit down and ask them to tell their story first and start at the beginning, how it was for them growing up. And they could only tell so much at a time because it was hard work telling their story. And so some women, it only took a few sessions of telling. Some it took 2 years. Each woman was different. So we stayed with them just like we did with Sarah till they completed their story. We didn't record them because they were so suspicious of any kind of technology, rightly so, because of their lives and how they were harmed by technology. So we had to really concentrate and listen. And then we got in the car and we sat down with a pen and paper and we wrote all the notes that we remembered, clarified ourselves what we remembered, and then we drove home. And then Jeanne would sit and put it all together in a document. Then we'd go back and get them to read it. And they clarified if we got everything right or if we made some mistakes. And of course, that was equality based. It was very relational because they had control over their own story. Nobody was telling them what they had said. They wanted it right for themselves. It was just thrilling to watch them grow through the telling. And that was a very feminist way to do that. And then we showed them the model at the end and asked them if it fit for them. And one woman in particular, she just took the model and took it to her chest and hugged it like it was something she really loved. It was like seeing herself on paper made herself so much more real because, of course, with the destruction as the goal of the torturer, women don't even see themselves as human beings. If you ask them to draw themselves, they'll draw as dots or squiggly lines, or they don't have any concept of themselves as a human person, let alone having skin and arms and legs and all those things. The destruction is so intense.
I know we're in an audio environment, so it's hard, but I would love for you to describe the non-state torture model, the circle, and what it looks like.
Our first model was ritual abuse torture. And that first model around the ritual abuse torture that's in the first book, Women on Silence, if you look at that model, you'll see that it goes from the MO of the perpetrator, their sense of superiority. And then when you go around the model, we talked about different forms of abuse, whether it was physical, whether it was sexualized, whether emotional. But then the more that we understood, we started seeing the organized crime. And then we broke down the organized networks. We started breaking down what that entailed. And you'll go around the model and you'll see the different forms of organized behavior. And over time, now we define it as non-state torture.
So it's evolved, essentially.
Yeah.
It evolved from, like, with your understanding of organized torture.
Yeah.
Yeah. We broke it down, the non-state torture, into 3 categories, but now it's evolved into 4 categories. We have the classic torture, is category 1. We have the commercial category, which is that the perpetrators are gaining some kind of benefit, whether it's financial, whether it's positional power. And so that means like human traffickers, it means pornographic perpetrators, because they're making all this money on the victimization that they're inflicting. It could be migrant women who are enslaved. You know, they thought they were being hired, but they end up being enslaved, and some of them are tortured. So that was the second category. The third category came about because of the UN special rapporteurs who looked at the so-called social norms, religious or traditional norms, that they understood that the pain and suffering was severe and often lifelong, like female genital mutilation, like child marriage, for example, and certain rituals that were perpetrated against women if their husbands died. And so we became involved with a group in Vienna, and we created the Non-State Torture Working Group. And through that conversation, we expanded to add a fourth category, which is violent groups and gangs. And that goes all the way from paramilitary to the mafia to the street gang. We had a whole study of global laws to see how countries around the world were looking at the issue of torture. And of course, it was what we know was generally the UN Convention Against Torture is shaped in such a way that a state actor has to be involved, has to know that torture is happening before they can be charged. So most criminal codes or penal codes are written with that discrimination of who can be charged, who could be a perpetrator. So that discrimination is written into law. And then we wrote a paper showing a victim-centered perspective, showing how all the victimization of non-state torture is perpetrated in every category. There may be new forms that evolve. We have to be open in our evolution to understand if we're going to practice from a victim-centered, person-centered perspective. We have to be able to listen to what people are saying and then see where it evolves.
We always showed the women, asked them feedback, and it was really exciting how much validation we got from them because they were really serious to make sure that it was right. That's where I felt validated, just from them, and knowing that it made sense to them. It gave them order. And the one piece that we probably haven't talked about is how important their human rights were, for them to know that they were persons, to know that they had human rights, to know that Article 5 of the UN Declaration on Human Rights says that no one shall be subjected to torture. That really, really gave them, even if they couldn't get legal justice, it gave them social placement that, yes, their human rights were being violated. And that's why we kept going to the UN. That's why we keep going. That's why we keep pushing the UN to open up the Committee Against Torture. We have it open some, but not enough yet. But we want a UN declaration on non-state torture, and we'd like to see it recognized as a crime against humanity, because indeed it is. I think it's one of the worst crimes against humanity because it starts with little tiny babies by people that are supposed to care about them. So it's the ultimate betrayal of trust and care. The brutality is just as severe as anything that happens in the state torture realm. So we won't be happy until it's recognized as a crime against humanity.
Suppose that was made a global law. What would be the ripple effects of having such a law?
You mean a declaration? Yeah, because it wouldn't be legal. Yeah. It wouldn't be legal, but it would be a global statement. So it makes it easier for any of us that are going to our own country and saying we want a law against non-state torture in our criminal code or in our penal code or whatever language the country uses. It would make it easier to get those state laws, because that's how the UN influences the world. It goes back to the member states, and then they accommodate the statements by changing their own criminal codes. And once you get a law, see, people don't realize, I don't think they think about a law is the ripple effect of a law. It's one thing to get legal justice for the victims, but it also changes the culture of the country, because then you have conversation that this law exists. So that means that this crime exists. So this means that these people exist in this country that need different care because it's a different crime, that children need to be educated about the crime and understand how to stay safe, like my daughter, for instance. And it eventually gets to prevention. And we also have data. When you have a law, you start gathering the data, because there's no data in the world right now around non-state torture. So once we get data, then we start measuring the impact of reducing the crime, and it really changes human behavior. So that's the impact that we're going for.
A very long view.
Yeah,
A very, very long plan.
Yeah.
I think it is very hard to maybe articulate or estimate what damage torture does to an individual person. And I think you do such a great job in the book of really sort of granularly make us understand the damage to a person. And I know it's a difficult thing to talk about as distinguished from, an assault, or what is it that torture does to a person?
I think you have to start, from my perspective, that the person that's in front of you is that a person first. Because I think we have a propensity to put the person at the back and put in front of her all the damage that's been done. And I don't think you can heal that way. I think the person has to know intuitively that they're a person. You're going to have to tell them that, because we know the women tell us, no, I didn't know I was a person until you told me. And that's when Linda brings in the human rights framework, that was critical to our nursing process. You're a person. That's what it says. And this is what I believe. And that's how I see you. So when you're asking the damage, it's ultimate. When the perpetrators can make that person non-human, that's the total damage that they can do. That person that's standing in front of you is no longer a person. That's what they do. They reduce that person to garbage. Women tell us that they thought maybe they were an it or a nothing. Several women talked about they didn't know they had skin. They didn't know they had any physicality. All of a sudden, they're learning that they have skin. And remember, one woman said, it's pretty amazing. I can feel putting my hand on the fountain and twisting the lever. I can feel that for the first time, that I have skin and I can touch that. So that's a very quick, ultimate answer, that person that's standing in front of you, knowing that they do not know they're a human being in any form, that's the total destruction. That's what the perpetrators aim to, that person will no longer exist in their mind. The critical issue for Linda and I was that we do the opposite of what the perpetrators do. In other words, when the woman comes, we know she's a person. We know she has skin. We know that she has a brain. She might not know that. Often they tell us their brain doesn't feel right. So when we do the opposite, that was our framework. The perpetrators are intent on destroying. We're intent of finding a way to help them learn about themselves as a person, to know they're a good person, know they have values, and know they have the right to exist in the universe equal to everyone else. So from that perspective, we just did whatever intervention we thought would help them understand. Like in the first book, we talk about taking Sarah to the park because she was taken into the woods, and many women were taken into the woods, taken in different places, farms, wherever the perpetrators had control of, that they felt that they could do whatever they wanted to do. So with Sarah, we knew that she was taken to a hunting camp, tied to trees. So she learned to think that the trees were part of the problem of the victimization. So taking her to the park, that starts creating some safety in the environment, because not only is the perpetrator, but they create their whole environment as being unsafe, because everywhere they take them is a torture chamber, if you will. And all the tools that are in that environment are danger, because they're all used, whether they take a branch and use it as a whip, whether they tie to a tree. Sarah was taken to a hunting camp and told to start running, and they start shooting. We did not believe that she could heal by just staying in a room somewhere. We knew the whole environment had to be transformed, and she had to learn that for herself. So we did a lot of outdoor healing. She couldn't understand why she was shot at and hit with bullets and a gun and didn't die. So by chance asked her if she had an example of the bullet that she was hit with. And she said, oh, yes. So she showed it to us. It wasn't a real bullet. It was a plastic casing. It hurt, but it would not kill. So we had to keep clarifying, because the perpetrator's intent is destruction, like Linda has explained, that person no longer exists as a person. And for us, it's to undo everything we could learn that they do. So one of the things that Linda brought up was the disassociation. From our experience, healing disassociation is essential, because as long as there's disassociation, the perpetrators can use that if they can have any contact whatsoever with the person they're victimizing, because all it takes is a look or sound or any suggestion, and the disassociation happens. And another example that we learned, because we were public health nurses and used to going to people's homes, we did go to Sarah's apartment, and we went and knocked on the door, and the door opened. She was standing behind the door, because she had never learned that she could refuse to open a door. She was so conditioned to open the door. Didn't matter time of day, who was there. She never asked those questions. She just opened the door, and she was victimized. She could learn to say no, because you have to understand that when you've been victimized from the time you were born, some of the first language a little child learns is no, but they don't have that right to say no.
No boundaries
No
for
boundaries
your
whatsoever.
physical body. Yeah.
No voice. See, that's the
No
thing.
voice.
No voice. If you have no voice, you have no saying about yourself whatsoever. And so we really help them develop a relationship with themselves. She had no positive sense of self at all. So to build the positive and always keep going towards the positive and develop your own voice. She had all these voices in her head, but all they were the perpetrators. They were the perpetrators' voices. So it was really hard for her to start inserting what her voice would be in that. It was really, really hard to really know that you have your own voice and your own thoughts and your own feelings. That's part of the reclaiming oneself. It's really important.
You talked a little bit about the various categories of perpetrators and so on, but I'd like to try to get a little bit of an understanding. I have such trouble imagining who are these people in your town or city, or I understand that they hide in plain sight. I absolutely get that concept, and that they often, it's pillar of community people with power. But can you talk a little bit about who are the torturers?
Well, they're like any group that find each other. They have just as probably say one word or two words and everybody knows what it means. Parties is the word you hear about in Epstein all the time. They say they had parties. That's what they told the kids too, that we're going to take you to a party. So, you've got a premier of our province, lawyers, doctors, other politicians, nurses, social workers, everyday people like fishers, farmers, women and men both, block parents that are supposed to be safe for kids to come to after school, volunteers in school, religious people, priests, nuns. That's why you can't really know for sure who any of them are. You just have to trust. That's why kids have to be taught to listen to themselves if they have a gut feeling, and to really learn what the MO of the perpetrator is, like the manipulation of a perpetrator, all their techniques. And that's where we got the pleasure, I think. I mean, they have pleasure in the hunting of the victims. We have pleasure in exposing the MO of the perpetrators. That's where we really start to get safety. And I was watching this woman talk about a friend of hers. She's a reporter in the United States, and a friend of hers is a very rich man. And he went to Epstein, not knowing him, and sat down, and Epstein started manipulating him. And he said he was shocked at how much he knew about him. And of course, that's what the perpetrators do. They learn as much as they can about you so that they can tell you what you want to hear. And then they just keep feeding you with all those things.
That's another thing that occurs to me too. Like each story of each woman that you're talking about is very distinct.
Yes.
It's a very custom-made sort of situation. I'm sure you see patterns, but yeah, they're very distinct. So Lynn's story was a whole different. Can you go into that a little bit?
As we started listening to more and more stories, we expanded our understanding of the different kinds of non-state torture that would happen, even though it's in the classic sense. And then it moved into category 2, both of them, because they both were trafficked. So she was a young woman in her 20s who grew up in a normal, I'd say unhealthy, not healthy, but unhealthy family, but they weren't abusive. And she went on a vacation to Lake Ontario in Canada with a friend, and this guy was probably hunting on the lake, and he approached her and started telling her that she was beautiful and all those things. And eventually they got connected, and she eventually married him. And just before she married him, he choked her with a necklace on her neck. And she said she realizes now that was a warning sign she probably should have paid more attention to, because she really had no concept that torture could happen in a marriage, no concept at all. And 6 months after they were in Nova Scotia, and he was just becoming more abusive and more controlling and more manipulative, he said, why don't we move to Ontario? And she thought it would be great because it would be good for their marriage. So they got on the plane, and on the plane he shifted. She knew then by the look in his eyes that he'd shifted. And after they got off the plane, 3 men met her there with him, and they threw her in the back seat of a car, and they drove her to this house and dragged her up the stairs and handcuffed her to a radiator. And she was there for 4.5 years until she escaped. And she was gang raped the first day. That's one of the strategies they call the breaking ground of human trafficking. And she was trafficked and tortured to many, many men. So many, she said she could never imagine how many. She couldn't count them all, including 10 policemen who came in their police uniforms on their breaks at lunchtime. That tells us that they were organized in the sense that the police were protecting their criminal informal network. And she was fed only water and rice till she was down to 70 some pounds. And they left money on the chair one day, and she grabbed it and took off. And we think that probably they knew she was on her deathbed, and they didn't want to be responsible for her dying in their presence. So they thought if she got away and died somewhere else, it would save them. So she escaped and came back to Nova Scotia and told the priest what had happened. He said, well, you're a prostitute. Go back to your husband. It's all your fault. And she never told anyone again for 25 years till she met me as a home care coordinator. Now, people say that, trafficking doesn't happen that way. There's not people chained to radiators, but there are. There's all the continuum, and we have to look out for the whole continuum, or we're going to miss those that have been chained to a radiator. And she was so traumatized because of all the victimization that she wouldn't accept care in the way that the nurses wanted to offer it. So she was labeled as a difficult client, and they wanted to not do her care. I said, that's not right. So I talked to her and asked her whatever happened to her in her life, whoever treated her in such a way that she was responding to care. And she started talking about her husband. And then Jeanne and I started listening to her, and 2 years later, she was healthy and healed. Not healthy physically. The the long-term effects of the MS were really impactful. But she was healthy emotionally and psychologically and spiritually because she really knew that it wasn't her fault. She learned to disassociate as a young woman to cope. So that even though she wasn't disassociating as a teenager, she learned to, just like the prisoners of war, dissociate to cope. Because you're chained to a radiator, you can't get away. The only way you can get away is in your mind. That's where the dissociation comes in. So she undid all that, and she took care well from the staff. They loved her, and they were there when she died, and they were thrilled to help her. So it was so beautiful to see a woman go from what I met her to be to how she ended up dying. It was lovely. So that's the positive in it again, eh?
Yeah. And you wrote a book about her case.
Yes.
The process of healing, yeah?
Right. So that people could understand how we helped her heal and then apply it. And the interesting thing is, a woman that I know that works for home care here in Nova Scotia, she bought the book and she's been reading it. And she said she's already using our explanations in the science of the care. And she's had 2 women who are in home care disclose to her that they were tortured, that she didn't know, but she knew that they had extreme responses. So that's the ripple effect of learning how to understand what the responses are.
The point historically, we have to remember, I have a book up there on my shelf. It was written in 1910. It's called The White Slave Trade. And the traffickers were hunting then. They were hunting on the wharfs and the train stations, looking for what they thought were women by themselves, girls that they felt that they could trick. And in the book, there were 2 men. They knew that if they gave the girl that they had to these 2 men, that those 2 men would totally destroy her in a weekend. And then they would send her on to Chicago to be prostituted, if you will, captive and enslaved and prostituted. So the crime is really no different. It's just that the error has changed. We're understanding differently, but they knew about how to destroy the women that they were and girls they were victimizing. Some of them were girls. And the reason it really came to attention is that in one section of the book, it talks about 100 girls that they knew had been trafficked into Maine, and a third of them came from Nova Scotia. That's how we got kind of triggered the interest, if you will, thinking, oh, that's interesting, because the province we live in, Nova Scotia, has the highest rate of human trafficking in Canada that we're aware of, police reported. So we have a long historical history, if you will.
Well, I think it's since the beginning of time, really. We've just perfected it. I mean, when you look at the burning times and the women then, there was torture before then. This is what gets me. All these centuries that we've been tortured, and we're not good enough for the word. It's not like torture. What's happening to women and girls that we're describing is torture. It's not like torture. And it's just, it's really frustrating. I don't have to worry about the 60 years anymore because we have a network now that started in January, and there's lots of young women that are just as motivated as us. So they'll want to carry on if we're not around anymore.
Tell me a little bit about what you started.
Yeah, well, we were at PHILIA, the Feminist International Conference in Brighton. We had a panel there, and there was a panel of young women feminist activists, lawyers, and survivor of pornography and a survivor of non-state torture, and Jeanne and I. And after the panel, it was very well received, very, very well received. So we knew that we were gaining momentum. It's just like people are really starting to get it. And one of the panelists, Mariana da Cunha, who's a lawyer from Portugal, she said to me, Linda, what do you think? Do you think we could start a network? And I said, I think that's an excellent idea. And of course, everybody that was there loved the idea. So we became the core group. And then we planned for the launch. We had a launch in February. And now we've got over 100 people that are interested. And we're starting to plan a conference in November in Lisbon, where we can sit down for a day as like-minded individuals from all over the world to talk about how we can move forward around stopping non-state torture and having a declaration and hopefully a tribunal. And we're all very motivated, very inspired by each other. And it's just a positive experience.
That's great. At your UN panel the other day that I attended, you talked about the work of making a declaration and making laws, et cetera. And you said something that stuck with me, which was survivors have a lot of collaborative evidence that can be correlated and corroborated, but no one's asking the right questions. And I feel like the work is to change everybody's minds so that the right questions are asked.
That's right. Instead of focusing on all the responses and controlling the responses, if you help them let it out and talk about the victimization, then we've got all the stories, all the information we need. That's the data. That's the evidence of the crime. And that's what's being silenced right now. And it really has to stop.
There's one thing to say physical torture happens, but what is physical torture? So what we did, we listened to what the women were saying. They broke it down because they didn't say I was physically tortured. That was not their everyday language. They would say that if you bend a coat hanger and I'm whipped with it, it doesn't leave marks that last very long. They'll give you that kind of evidence. Like Lynn handcuffed to the radiator. And the way she escaped, she said there was a different cuff. She thinks it was a kiddie cuff, and she was able to get her hand out of it. They break that down and tell you the soles of their feet were beaten. Most people wouldn't think that that's physical torture. Yet we have, like in women who were prostituted, 50% of, I think it was 30 something in the questionnaire, half of them said the soles of their feet were beaten. So then we could go to the torture literature, and that's called phalangia. There's a word for it. How come we can only use it for men who are tortured and somehow it disappears when women, the soles of their feet are beaten? Or why do we all of a sudden want to transpose it? We come back to the discrimination again. But we have 48 terms in the question that they can identify, and then there's room for them to add whatever they want to add. One woman added specifically pins under her fingernails or under her toenails. Well, I have a book up there that is a drawing of state torture with pins being put under the man's fingernails. Why is it that the torturer, a non-state torturer, can do that and somehow not be held accountable? So we had to break down the language so that, number one, it tells the women that we're listening. It tells the women that we're hearing. It also helps the women develop the language to clarify if they want to make a victim impact statement, that they could go through this and say, this, and this happened. And it gives them the language. Like they say, it helps them develop their language. And drawing does too. If they draw and then they have to explain it, then they learn how to define what happened to them.
It becomes concrete.
It becomes concrete, and it gets rid of that chaos when you're trying to explain something that you want somebody to understand and you've got chaos that's not clear. So that they can use the questionnaire to do that, to clarify. And it also helps them heal, because all of a sudden it starts transforming the chaos into very clear language. So they're hearing, and that starts healing the chaos and the confusion. And then they can start realizing, this is not something I did to myself. There's not something that I asked for. It's not something that I deserved. They were the ones that did it to me. So it becomes a multifunctional intervention, actually. And we've developed that questionnaire, and we have much collective evidence from Australia. Some are from New Zealand, from Israel. Some are Canadian, some are American, some are from Mexico, some are from the UK, some are from Germany,
Papua New Guinea, everywhere.
All talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I really wanted to bring up, because it's the future and where we're headed with young women, the Bukaki case is a case in France of 50 young women They were all tricked into pornography when they were in their teens, like 14, 15. And so they got out of the pornography, but they're now in their 30s and they've come back as a group of 50 of them, insisting that they were tortured. They don't want to call it anything else but torture. And to think that in this day and age, we are calling it adult entertainment, that a man, and or some women watch it, I guess, too, can sit down and watch a woman be strangled, gang raped, hog-tied, brutalized in any way possible, and think that that's entertainment and not torture. That's such a lie. And these women are standing up and saying, no, we're not taking this. Because that's what happens. They get pulled in when they're little. I mean, you're only 14. You don't understand the world yet, let alone that you're being tricked into something as atrocious as that. And then, of course, they internalize the blame and then they're trapped in it. So I'm so hoping for them that they win their case. And we met one of the women. She came and spoke, and it was just a thrill to see her stand there. And she said she was so proud after, and she got, a standing ovation, and she went back to Paris knowing that our network is going to support them, and so that they know that they're not alone, that they have 3 excellent lawyers, but they also have a band of women that are standing with them.
That's amazing and so empowering, not just for them, but for all of us. And talk about a shift, from pornography as something everyone does to, reframing it as an atrocity, which it absolutely is.
Absolutely.
When we're talking about pornography, about human trafficking and the many forms of victimization that go on, if we want to build resilience and support, we have to start talking that victimization starts with infants and goes the continuum, not to invisibilize the continuum, because the point is we have evidence. In the UK, they have an organization that looks at internet victimization of children, and they see the videos of infants. They're talking about that infants and young children are tortured and dehumanized. In Canada, we have one in Winnipeg, and they're saying the same thing. So that population is voiceless. And as adults, we have a responsibility not to engage in their invisibilization. So one of the interventions at the UN last week was to say, if you're going to teach about non-state torture and human trafficking, please start with infants and go the continuum. That's how we're going to change society, because we can only change what we know.
You have to take the entire scope into view, so to speak.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. So you don't miss the cues of what population you're working with.
Right.
Yeah.
And it tells us volumes about who the perpetrators are.
Yeah,
absolutely, doesn't it?
You have people who are interested in torturing and sexually violating infants. That's a pertinent thing for everyone to know.
Exactly. Exactly.
You did also say another thing about this is all in the realm of how do we end it, that goal 1 should be to sunset all statute of limitation on sexual crimes and violence crimes. Just get rid of statute of limitation, period, end of story.
That's for sure. Because, if you've been tortured from the time you're an infant, it's going to take you a while to really clarify enough to go to court just to be able to describe your crime. You can't do that in a matter of a couple of years as an adult. It takes longer for many of them. If you understand the crime, then you'd know that statute of limitations is really destructive.
There's a reason for that, too, to understand their survival responses, because what we've learned with women who were born into families who victimized them, tortured and trafficked them from infancy, in the healing process, and we've seen this repeatedly, and you only learn by staying present with someone, is that what happens is that they can start having infant responses. We find a way that they can do that and be respectful knowing they're adults. And by staying with them, we see that there's a process that they go through this. It may not last very long, but the fact they can speak it and reenact, if you will, and it just doesn't come back. And the issue of being incontinent, because even adults talk about the fact that if they're in a life-threatening situation, they can lose their speech and can also become incontinent.
Sure. It's a fear response, isn't it? Yeah.
That's right.
Terror response. Yeah.
If we don't stay present long enough to understand the full impact of what the MO of the perpetrators, our tendency is to pathologize or to do more harm. Because with the network, there's the task of trying to have the legal system and lawyers understand the normal MO of a woman who has survived childhood or adulthood victimization of torture and trafficking, so that they can gain a way to present it in court so judges also can learn normal responses and they have a fair chance if they want legal justice. If they can escape and they're out, that doesn't mean all their learned behavior and how their body responses are not just going to disappear overnight, because their body is responding to how they were victimized and how we might not understand clearly because that's not our experience, but we have to know all these realities to be respectful to the women.
And that's where our nursing came in again, you see, because we always looked for the reason for the behavior. We never saw them as mentally ill. We saw them as victimized and that they were women. So if you were little and you had all these gaps, growth and developmentally, so we understood that. So we just looked at them as women who had those gaps and that they had to go back and reclaim those gaps to be able to move forward out of that age and not be, being triggered back into younger ages or other normal responses.
For people that are not nurses and for people who haven't seen what you've seen, this is extraordinary difficult information to digest in any way. It almost fills you with shame of being human at all, that this goes on. It's unbearable information.
We always focused on the woman and kept seeing the positives. And we had the nursing process, which is you're always outcome focused. So each session you could see growth. It was continuous over and over. So if you focus on the growth, the perpetrators are there. We had their MO and we figured it all out, but we followed their path of growth. And that's what sustained us, was the growth. And that's how I see this, as our information is going to be able to promote social growth, that we as humans will learn more and more and it'll happen less and less. But to put it in perspective too, we asked the women and they were consistent. It was interesting. How many people, or what percentage do they think were non-state torturers? So they all said about 20%. So that means of all the violence, 20% would be non-state torture. Then you'd have neglect and abuse and maltreatment. So 20% keeps it smaller than starting to think that everybody in the world is a torturer, because that's where you go with this, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And then we have the good people that are stopping it. So to keep the balance of perspective, to know that these are really terrible, but there's not as many of them as we might imagine. There's too many. One's too many. But if we put our mind to it, we can really start making an impact on this crime.
That's great. And I do think, of course, as you come back to again and again in the book, the fact that we're all born into patriarchy and men's power over is the most salient thing, that we really need to get our society egalitarian for all of our sakes, because that's how we hold ourselves accountable. We can't allow people to be above reproach. It's bad. It's bad for humans.
Absolutely. Knowing feminism was such an important piece of sanity in all this, to understand patriarchy and understand how it functions and all the structures and how the corruption functions because of the patriarchy. Being a feminist is a gift for anyone that really wants to really dive into it. It makes the world seem much more ordered than chaotic.
If we could come to that, to try to share a world where we all respect each other and try to do the best on this planet, it would make a difference. But obviously, we have a ways to go.
We do.
And we're in a backlash time, which is unfortunate, but it won't last forever.
It won't last forever. Thank you for listening to Subject to Power. You can find the show online at subjecttopower.com or subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcasts. I'd love to know your thoughts on these conversations, so please drop a note on the website or find us on social media. The best way to support the show is to rate and review Subject to Power on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other listeners find us. Subject to Power is written, hosted, and produced by me, El Kamihira. Audio engineering is done by Jason Sheasley at Abridged Audio. Cover art by B. Johnson, and music by Beware of Darkness.